So basically, our hypothesis was that employing diazepam in gradual steps pairings of adult Rhesus macaques would be more successful than the common practice of implementing gradual steps pairing without medication and produce comparable results to full contact pairings using diazepam, as reported in the Easer et al. Study, and that introductions using a lower dose of diazepam would be similarly successful to those using a higher dose.
Welcome to The Last Word, the official ALAS podcast dedicated to connecting and informing the laboratory animal science community. Each episode takes a closer look at recent articles published in our journals, JLAS and LAS Pro, and features interviews with professionals advancing the field. I'm Jennifer Smith, your host. As a laboratory animal veterinarian and the Director of Education and Scientific Affairs at ALAS, I look forward to sharing these conversations with you. Let's discover something new together. Hello! With me today is Dr. Adam K. Myers, who is a veterinarian and an LATG, which I think is amazing. Adam is currently an instructor and clinical veterinarian at Tulane National Primate Research Center. He has such a wonderful background, so I'm going to let him introduce himself. But before that, I want to introduce this article, which has been recently published in JLAS, titled Evaluating Outcomes of Diazepam Administration in Gradual Steps, Introductions of Adult Male and Female Rhesus Macaques. Adam, welcome. Please tell us about yourself.
Hi, Jennifer. Thank you for having me.
Of course.
I'm originally from California, Southern California to be specific. I went to college at the University of California, San Diego, and got a bachelor's of science in general biology there. My original plan was to become a research scientist. Never really thought about becoming a veterinarian at any point. If I'm being perfectly honest, I didn't have the best grades, so grad school didn't really seem like the best option for me at the time.
Me either, friend. So
yeah.
We all get here eventually.
And that was unfortunate. I needed a little bit of direction. So actually, right after college, I went back home from San Diego to Oxnard and started a job as an animal care technician at Taconic Biosciences. So mainly just doing mouse and rat husbandry. And thankfully, I worked my way up through the ranks pretty quickly. Within 6 months, I was actually promoted to what they called a team coordinator, which is a supervisor of the ACTs there. And I was actually put on our surgery, although we didn't really do surgery per se, but I was in charge of the surgery projects that were going on, which was mostly superovulation of mice at the time, and then maintaining our pseudopregnant colonies and embryo transfer, some things that we were in partnership with Amgen. It was a great opportunity, great experience getting familiarized with mice and rats, but knew it wasn't exactly what I wanted out of my career. So a couple of years later, I started looking into other opportunities, trying to get back into the research world, seeing what avenues I could take to get into grad school. And I saw that there was a job opening for a neuroscience lab manager position at UCLA with Michelle Basso. So I interviewed with her, got that job, and that was where I was first introduced to non-human primates, specifically Rhesus macaques. And then I also got a ton of experience with pigs, rabbits, and of course, continued with mice and rats in that role as well. And this was the first time that I really learned what a lab animal vet is and what they do. I just thought it was absolutely fascinating that people in these labs, these PIs with their postdocs, their scientists, were able to just do all these really cool surgical procedures on animals, and that the vet was kind of in an advisory role on that, but also training and sometimes doing the procedures. So that was a totally new world to me. And so I actually assisted a lot with anesthesia and surgeries, and developed an aptitude for these kind of things. And I was told by the vet technicians that I also got really comfortable with that I should think about becoming a veterinarian. Thankfully, I got into vet school on my first attempt, even though I did have those bad grades coming out of college.
Me too.
There was only one school that took me. So I was like, I'm not going to waste this opportunity. I'm going to go for it. And I actually, before I went to vet school, was hired additionally as a vet tech with UCLA. And I actually did that into my second year of vet school as well, commuting from Pomona, California to Los Angeles, California on the weekends to take care of the pigs, the mice, the rats, the Rhesus macaques, which is like an hour and a half commute each way on the weekends. So that was a lot, but obviously I was still successful with that. So I graduated from Western University of Health Sciences, a College of Veterinary Medicine in 2021. And then right after that, I started a residency at, oh, I should probably back up. So a cool thing that I did while I was in vet school, lab animal specific, I did the summer T35 research fellowship at Stanford University. And I was actually able to get a publication out of that as well, which was my first publication. And with that, it was in conjunction with a lab up at the California National Primate Research Center. And Karen Parker and her team had actually identified a naturally occurring low social model of Rhesus macaque that has similar behavioral features to people with autism that they had done a lot of studying on. And the way summer T35s work is it's run by a veterinarian there, and they basically take veterinary students and put them into labs so that they can get research experience. And usually you don't get publications out of that, but I was very fortunate to have the opportunity. I actually did it over 2 summers to get a publication out of it. And the idea was using this low social monkey model of autism. Monkeys don't have autism. That's an important distinction to make. They're just low social with similar features to people with autism. We wanted to look at if they had higher prevalence of comorbidities, mainly gastrointestinal issues, trauma, wounding related episodes, and other just comorbidities, because actually, particularly like GI related issues, are a big problem in people with autism. They experience those at a much higher rate than the normal population. So what we found was, while we didn't see a difference with those low social monkeys in terms of the increased prevalence of GI issues, they were more likely to be wounded by the conspecifics, which we attributed to probably just not being able to socialize appropriately with other monkeys. So that was really awesome. And that was a huge help too, because I knew for sure that I had at least one requirement out of the way for lab animal boards. I went through the review process for boards, and that paper actually qualified for my publication that I would need to sit for ACLAM boards. So after graduating vet school and doing that program, I went and started my residency at the Tulane National Primate Research Center in 2021. I completed that in 2024, which is a little bit unique because typically we do a 2-year residency at the TNPRC, but because we were having kind of a vet shortage around 2022, I essentially petitioned the faculty for a hybrid role. So I was hired on as a hybrid faculty resident from 2022 until I finished my residency in 2024. So it took me a little bit longer to finish than normal, but I was working as a full-time vet there as well. So I have been in that faculty role now since 2022, and I'm one of the breeding colony vets specifically at Tulane National Primate Research Center.
Wow.
Yeah.
I loved hearing all of that. That's the best part of the show, in my humble opinion. I love it. And I love, as a fellow Southern Californiaite, and Adam and I were joking before the show, we were in the same place. Obviously, I was there first,
right.
several years ahead of Adam, but it's fun to see a lot of those programs, especially the T35. I actually did that as well for 2 summers with dairy cows at Michigan State. I'm so thankful that that's still going, and let's cross our fingers that it's still getting funded. But same thing, that we are kindred spirits that way, as well as the grades. I definitely had to go back and do some remedial work before I got into vet school. And you know what? It's okay. I feel like we're all on a journey, right? And we're all going to get there eventually. So, all right. Well, thank you for all that. I loved it. And I know our listeners love it too. And they can identify with so many parts of that. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Okay. So this paper, it's good. Yep. It's a good one. So introduce us to the team quickly. Tell us who did what. We know it takes a team, and we want to make sure we give credit to everybody on the paper.
Absolutely. So huge thanks goes out to Dr. Kate Baker. She is a behavioral biologist with the Unit of Behavioral Management at the TNPRC. She has been there for decades at this point. She was primarily responsible for helping me with study design, data interpretation, and analysis, and the majority of the editing of my manuscript. So while a lot of that language is definitely mine, like a lot of it was her just making it sound better. She is an expert in the field of non-human primate social housings, introductions, behavior, with decades of experience, as I mentioned, has contributed a lot to the field in terms of publications and this, that, and the other. And then a big thing that she does for us at the Primate Center is she regularly assists the lab animal residents with their research projects, which generally concern animal behavior and welfare. And of course, she's one of my co-authors. In addition, we've got Rochelle McAndrew. She's no longer at the Primate Center. She went, I believe, up to MIT. She was our behavioral management program manager, which she just helped me a lot with the initial selection of study participants and, of course, coordinating animal movement and study scheduling. This was just part of her normal work duties, so it wasn't really adding too much to her plate, thankfully. Huge shout out to Michelle Kubish and James Walsh. They are both senior unit of behavioral management technicians at the Primate Center. They both conducted my pairings, introductions, and they were responsible for determining pair compatibility and pair success or failure. Both have many years' experience in behavior monitoring, social housing, and Rhesus macaques. And UBM technicians, as part of their job, assess all the social housing and introductions, animal compatibility, and also any animal returns or group formations that we do. So animals that are going back out to the breeding colony after they've presented to the hospital for various cases, or putting animals together for the first time to form new groups. And then I do want to say about Michelle that she was also the one who did the coding of all of my behavior videos for this study and is also one of our co-authors. The last two people I will mention are that were on my team. Dr. Casey Russell-Lodrigue, she is the current Associate Director and Chief VMO, or Veterinary Medical Officer, and Chair of the Division of Veterinary Medicine at the Primate Center. She was my residency director, and at the time of my residency, the Assistant Director for Clinical and Research Medicine. She provided a lot of feedback and advice during monthly progress meetings that I would have with her and other faculty, just talking about my residency and how things were going, and specifically about the research project. And of course, is one of my co-authors. And then finally, Dr. Rudolph Boehm Jr. He is also no longer with the Primate Center. He's now the director of the Oregon National Primate Research Center, but he was the former associate director and CVMO and chair, which that role has now been taken by Dr. Russell. And same thing with him. He provided a lot of feedback and advice during those monthly progress meetings and is also listed as a co-author.
Oh, that's great. You have a lot of support up there, and I think that's fabulous. Thank you for sharing and introducing us to them.
Yep.
All right. So speaking of introduction, you got a good one here. I learned a lot, especially just you have a lot of acronyms, and I think you just spelled it out really well for people that maybe don't use primates every day, want to extrapolate this information into maybe other species. So have at it. Can you give us kind of a good synopsis of your introduction? And then we always like to just really hear clearly what the hypothesis of the study was.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm going to be a little bit specific here because, as Jennifer mentioned, we use a lot of acronyms here. And I do try to spell it out really well in the paper itself, but it can get a little bit confusing as we repeat them a lot. But
Sure.
So I just want to say the most important thing up front, non-human primates, like most animals, are social animals that benefit from social housing, which is always the default that we go to for environmental enhancement. Enhancement and enrichment are kind of synonymous terms, but we like enhancement because we find it enhances them. And of course, the most important thing for the variety of species in lab animal, it is a regulatory requirement unless specific criteria are met. And those are listed out. But basically, animals that are exempted for clinical reasons, if they're overly aggressive or debilitated, those sorts of things. But with that being said, it's one of the most challenging environmental enhancement strategies to implement. And that's mainly due to just candidate availability and compatibility, space and resource limitations, time constraints, not only for the animals, but also for staff, of course, and then external stressors or stress factors. So, of course, we're always looking for ways to refine and improve upon existing methodology to facilitate social housing of Rhesus. And anybody who's worked with Rhesus will let you know that they can be a very challenging species to work with. They are aggressive animals, and there's a lot of nuance to their behavioral interactions with others. So introduction methods generally fall under two main strategical categories. That's full contact or protected contact. So when you see FC, that means full contact. PC is protected contact. Basically, full contact means that animals move from no contact directly into full when introduced. And the two methods that are specifically mentioned in here are transport and anesthetization. I'll go into a little bit more detail about those. While protected contact includes in this intermediate phase of limited physical and or full visual contact before progressing to full contact. And of course, we have a few methodologies listed out in the paper of protected contact. Those are rapid steps, cage run cage, and gradual steps, which gradual steps is the one that was used in this study. So some advantages and disadvantages of the two main categories. So full contact advantages, they are very quick to implement and they potentially limit initial wounding, specifically with the transport method, which involves moving animals in transport cages within or between facilities prior to that full contact introduction in a larger enclosure. There's a little bit of stress that's associated with that process while they're being transported in kind of a new environment. And that stress is actually kind of beneficial in a way, in that once they get out into the larger enclosure with this new partner, they're going to expend more of that energy coping with those environmental changes and that stress rather than directing that energy towards the new partner. So that's a big advantage of the transport method. With the anesthesia method, essentially animals are anesthetized before they are put into full contact and then allowed to recover in that phase. And so that post-anesthetic sedation of monkeys paired via this method allows them to recover. It's believed will help to limit anxiety-driven behaviors during early interactions and allow the intro to unfold in calmer settings. As far as some of the disadvantages of that methodology, that initial wounding inhibition may lead to a false sense that animals are compatible, and more staff time may be needed to assess pair compatibility because it may not be apparent at the beginning that they are incompatible, but there might be some other behaviors that develop over time that would require more monitoring. And then the transport method specifically may limit staff's ability to separate animals, and it's not usually the most feasible due to space limitations and different housing configurations. Sometimes facilities won't have those larger enclosures to move those animals out to for brief periods, especially if they're just pairing animals. So that can be a little bit challenging. And then, of course, with anesthetization, the big concern would be that pairs recover at different rates. And so conscious animals may be in there with still anesthetized animals and could potentially wound them. Moving on to protected contact. So some of the advantages of protected contact, they minimize injury risk in the early phases because there's either limited physical contact or just visual contact. You can do incremental compatibility assessments. There's a promotion of competence in some of the monkeys as they have the choice to approach a prospective partner. Because they're separated, they can go into the far ends of their enclosure and not necessarily be close to that other animal. And there's a lot of flexibility and the feasibility according to available enclosures. And then looking at some of the specific methods, so rapid steps, this is one that involves an initial visual contact only phase before that progression to full contact, of course, has less staff time involved. And there's this ability to see a full range of dominant submissive behaviors earlier in the pairing process. With the cage run cage, the protected contact phase starts in the home environment. So whatever they're currently housed in is what we mean. So the cage. And then that full contact phase occurs in a larger enclosure away from the home environment, similar to how a transport method would be done, except that there's not that initial stress of being in a new enclosure prior to the larger enclosure. And then assuming that those animals are successful in full contact in that larger enclosure, we then would move them back to their home environment, but now in full contact. So with that initial full contact phase in the cage run cage method, that allows for that additional flight space and preventing influence from other familiar animals housed in the home environment, which is one of its primary advantages. And then finally, the gradual steps method, which is the most common pairing method and the one that's used in this study. It's similar to the rapid steps, albeit with a longer initial protected contact phase that also allows for limited physical contact. So where rapid steps was visual only, gradual steps includes a panel that allows the animals to actually physically interact. So while it allows for physical contact, that initial physical contact is a little bit more limited, which can be beneficial in some ways. And then it allows for longer initial compatibility assessments as well. Some of the main disadvantages of protected contact, so both the cage run cage and gradual steps methods require more staff time and can create a false sense of security as contact aggression may not occur until animals are paired in full contact. And then our thought, and one thing that we try to definitely argue in the study, and we'll get into that a little bit more, is that PC may create a frustration among animals due to the delay before they are able to enter full contact. And so all of this very specific, detailed information is really just to illustrate to you all that there's a lot of nuance and challenges of developing and implementing pairing techniques for macaques, which really leads to this desire to investigate novel strategies, especially looking at pharmacological interventions. And so there was a recent study done by the resident just before me. Her name was Dr. Sarah Kieser, in which her study looked at full contact introductions of unfamiliar adult male Rhesus that have been administered diazepam in comparison to the standard gradual steps pairing method that is used at the majority of non-human primate institutions, especially Tulane. And diazepam was selected because it has well-documented anxiolytic and sedative properties. It's shown a lot of beneficial things in a variety of areas, therapeutic areas. And so in that study, they found that when using diazepam at that higher dose of 3.2 mg per kg, that full contact introductions of unfamiliar adult male Rhesus were highly successful. I want to say it was around 94%. However, concerns amongst the non-human primate institutions persist regarding the implementation of full contact introductions involving drugs, and the gradual steps method, as I've mentioned a couple of times, is still typically employed by most, including ourselves. Therefore, we wanted to build upon those findings by examining the role of diazepam in addition to, rather than in place of, protected contact. So, the aim of our study was to examine outcomes using this diazepam dosing strategy prior to the protected contact phase for forming isosexual pairs of both male and female Rhesus, and assess the utility of a refined dose to reduce the difficulties in gaining animals' cooperation with consuming medication and limit potential adverse effects of the drug. That was a sticking point for me because I felt like the dose that we were using was quite high. And also the lower dose that we selected here was previously reported in a paper to be highly beneficial in a number of different areas, decreasing wounding, improving social compatibility or longevity, and things like that. So basically, our hypothesis was that employing diazepam in gradual steps pairings of adult Rhesus macaques would be more successful than the common practice of implementing gradual steps pairing without medication and produce comparable results to full contact pairings using diazepam, as reported in the Easer et al. Study, and that introductions using a lower dose of diazepam would be similarly successful to those using a higher dose.
It's time for a quick break to hear about the ALAS Learning Library. Hey, are you ready to elevate your team's knowledge and skills in laboratory animal science? Well, the ALAS Learning Library is your one-stop solution for comprehensive training. With courses designed for everyone, you can train your entire team in one place, earn valuable ALAS CEUs and RACE CE credits, and take advantage of group discounts to maximize that investment. Getting started is easy too. Sign up for free to access select courses instantly to explore a vast library of resources. Empower your team, stay ahead of the field, and grow with the ALAS Learning Library, your trusted resource for laboratory animal science professionals. That is a lot of information that I asked you to summarize quickly, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do that, especially for our listeners that work with primates and may want to do something similar. It's always good to sort of understand more about the introduction. Okay, so now we know the introduction and we know what you were trying to do in the study. Give us quick highlights on sort of your study design, especially anything relating to equipment, technology, those types of things our listeners are always really interested in.
Definitely. So pretty simple design, nothing too fancy that was used in this. So one thing I do want to state up front is that animals were housed in sheltered outdoor housing. So not outdoors, not indoors, but sheltered outdoors, meaning that we had less control over relative humidity and the temperature. But these animals are housed in this area and are awaiting either breeding colony reintegration or they're being considered for research project assignment. As far as the animals that we used, all were specific pathogen free, healthy, and greater than 4 years old for both the males and the females. Proposed pairs were unfamiliar to one another, meaning that they were not previously housed in the same location. We tried to use disparate weights whenever possible. In other words, trying to pair a large animal with a small animal, which has shown benefits in terms of social housing outcomes in previous studies. And then the age distribution across all groups was very similar, as were other demographics and characteristics. So we used 3 groups per sex of 12 animals each for a total of 6 pairs per group and a total of 72 animals. So they were split into 3 groups, as I mentioned. So there was a low diazepam group that received 2.5 mg per kg orally prior to the PC phase, or the protected contact phase, a high diazepam group for both male and female that received or was administered 3.2 mg per kg orally of diazepam, and then the control group, which had no diazepam administered and underwent the normal gradual steps pairing process. So compatible pairs in protected contact had to remain there for a minimum of 2 days before progressing to full contact. So this was to just standardize the pairing process across all groups. Prior to that, animals were placed in adjacent enclosures and allowed to acclimate before the initial introduction attempt. So 3 days was that period. Protected contact was then established by replacing a solid panel between the potential pairs with a protected contact panel that would permit limited physical contact. And then the only difference between the controls and the diazepam groups was the administration of diazepam orally in high-value food items 30 to 45 minutes prior to initiation of protected contact. Success of the pair was determined to be if they remained in full contact for a minimum of 14 days. And the way we established full contact was just removing that protected contact panel. So again, they started next to one another. The protected contact panel was placed. They remained in protected contact for a minimum of 2 days if compatible. That panel was then removed. And then if they remained in full contact for 14 days, that was considered a success. The initial 10 minutes of each introduction were monitored by a behavior technician and myself. All phases of the introductions were video recorded. And in the first 10 minutes of those introduction videos were later coded by the behavior technician who was blind to the subject's group allocation using a standardized ethogram to assess aggressive, affiliative, anxiety-related, abnormal, and submissive behaviors. And those behaviors were used to determine pair compatibility and whether an introduction was safe to continue and or advanced based on the technician's experience and our established criteria. And then there were some delays in pairing, and that may have occurred due to the observance of concerning behaviors that did not warrant immediate separation, in which additional video footage was acquired but not used for subsequent analyses. Of course, if there was behavior that was escalating very quickly, such as aggression, those pairs were immediately separated. And any wounding that occurred that required veterinary care, we, of course, intervened, or I intervened specifically.
Oh, fantastic. That is a great summary and makes it very easy to follow along here. So let's jump right in. You've got some results and we really want to talk about your discussion. So go ahead and kind of let us know what you found and then, of course, what your thoughts were.
Okay. So not a whole lot of results here, but biggest thing, unfortunately, was that there was no statistical difference in pairing success for either sex overall, meaning that, neither males nor females. And of course, we only compared males to males and females to females because they're different.
Sure.
That none of the treatment groups nor the controls had higher or lower rates of success in terms of introduction.
Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting, right?
Yes. And it was somewhat surprising given the relatively great success seen in the previous study that I've mentioned a couple of times. So we have a lot of thoughts on that, and I'll get back to that.
Okay, good. We want to hear them. Yeah.
Yeah. However, I will point out that at least in the female low diazepam pairings, those were significantly more successful during the protected contact phase versus the female controls, at least, despite there being no difference in overall introduction outcomes between any of those groups. So even though they were more likely to succeed with the low diazepam females in the PC phase, protected contact phase, that was not predictive of success or failure overall. Males were generally more successful than females across all groups. I find that very fascinating and interesting. I think when people think about Rhesus macaques, they think of these big males that have these big canines, and those are going to be the really aggressive, mean ones. But
right, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking.
But they were kind of similar across all groups, like all did relatively well, whereas the females, they did not, So that was a little bit fascinating to me.
Yeah, that's a good word. Yeah. I agree.
And one of the really cool things, though, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is that descriptively, at least, maybe not significantly, but low diazepam modulated wounding severity in both males and females during both the protected contact and full contact phases. Essentially, low diazepam pairs were only separated due to incompatibility, while high diazepam and control pair failures in both sexes included wounding that required veterinary intervention. That's quite surprising to me as well.
Yeah, agreed.
And then finally, just another thing I want to point out is that female control pairs were also significantly more anxious than both the low diazepam and high diazepam pairs, and male controls were descriptively more anxious than both the low diazepam and high diazepam pairs during the PC phase specifically. This was expected. I mean, if they're given diazepam, it should have an anxiolytic effect. However, descriptively, aggression was seen more frequently, while affiliation less frequently in the male high diazepam groups compared to low diazepam in controls, which kind of goes opposite there.
Uh-huh.
Female low diazepam pairs descriptively exhibited more aggression despite that lower anxiety, while high diazepam pairs exhibited more affiliation during the full contact phase, which is opposite of males and opposite of what was, that kind of makes sense, but why were the female low diazepam pairs exhibiting more aggression when they're less anxious? So this was all very perplexing to us, given that the female low diazepam members were significantly more successful with less severe wounding, despite having higher levels of aggression and lower levels of anxiety, while the male behaviors seemed to be more congruent with each group's respective outcomes and wounding patterns.
Yeah, that is perplexing. So I want to hear. I want to know. Tell us.
All right. So getting into the meat of it, of course, there are clear benefits of social housing. Successful pairing of unfamiliar adult Rhesus macaques still remains a challenging proposition, replete with nuance. And so, really, current social housing research is focused on strategies to improve safety and outcomes, with recent evidence suggesting that the use of diazepam in full contact pairings of unfamiliar adult Rhesus leads to those successful outcomes. Therefore, we were trying to implement that in this gradual steps pairing methodology, which is the more common practice at non-human primate institutions. So again, we did not see similar pairing success rates in our study, indicating that diazepam administration at either dose did not really improve overall gradual steps pairing success. However, that does not mean it may not have some utility in this process. So there may be instances where animals can only be introduced into protected contact, and at least the female protected contact outcomes indicate that it may be a useful tool for those purposes, as the low diazepam group did have significantly higher levels of success at protected contact. However, that being said, I mentioned at the top of this that there are just some concerns with protected contact in general, in that the addition of that phase, when comparing it to that full contact introduction study, may have been an inhibiting factor, such that animals may have developed frustration due to the delay before full contact. And so while diazepam may reduce anxiety during those initial interactions, it cannot moderate potential frustration that develops over time, or it may have muted subjects' behaviors to such a degree that partners were unable to engage in necessary social exchange for developing those bonds. And to me, I think that's putting a little bit too much criticism on diazepam itself, because it has all these demonstrable anxiolytic effects that has been proven through various studies over time. Since we did not see adverse effects or sedation, because there are some paradoxical effects that have been noted with diazepam as well, where you get like this hyper-aggressive, hyper-excitable response. Since we did not see those, nor sedation that was expected, or not necessarily expected, because previous studies using these doses did not show signs of sedation either, it lends more to the notion that protected contact, especially its duration, may have impeded success. So as I mentioned, we wanted to standardize the introductions to make sure that there was enough congruency between all of the groups, that there weren't these potential confounds. And so having a protected contact phase for a minimum of 2 days, and in some pairs, because of some concerns with compatibility and some of the behaviors we were seeing, or if the protected contact phase had to extend into a weekend because we didn't have staff on site, it's possible that those delays to full contact, especially when they became longer, were instilling even more frustration in these animals. The other thing about that too is it's not really expected for diazepam to last, that full 2 days, to get the effects of that drug over those 2 days. And so I really want to place a lot of emphasis on that protected contact may have been the inhibiting factor here, as opposed to the drug not being effective, right?
Yes, got it. And I'm glad you said that, because I think, you don't want somebody to distill that out of this paper, certainly.
Yeah. And then, so going back to the wounding patterns, as I said, those were a very welcome surprise. And at least at the lower dose that was used in our study, we did see safer introductions, and that less severe wounding occurred in those groups than at least the standard gradual steps pairings. And I think that really warrants further experimentation, especially because, I mentioned in the discussion that there was a previous study that looked at even higher doses than what we used here, up to, I think, 10 mg per kg, where the higher the dose of the diazepam, the lower the frequency of attacks committed by the social partners. And so it was kind of interesting to see that with ours, the lower dose actually seemed to be the most effective at limiting those wounding episodes.
Yeah, that's also interesting. And I can't believe we're getting to the end here, but the anesthesia person in me has to ask this question. And that is alternatives to diazepam, like midazolam.
Sure.
I got to
Yeah.
know.
So,
What are your
okay.
thoughts?
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts.
Okay.
Well, midazolam is such an interesting drug to me because, according to like APV formularies, the order of magnitude for the dose range is actually a tenth lower than diazepam, what's considered an acceptable or safe range for diazepam. And I don't know if that's a typo or what, because I found that if I try to use midazolam at that lower dose, it's not as effective, which I initially thought like that would actually be great. Like if midazolam is that much more potent than diazepam, we could give it as an injectable if we're trying to reach these dosing levels. Because if diazepam is 2.5 mg per kg and it's an order of magnitude lower, it would only be 0.25. That's an injectable dose. You don't have to give that orally, right? But I found when applying those lower doses according to the APV formulary for midazolam, they've not been as effective. So when we were in the study design phase, that was an initial thought I had, like, why don't we switch it up? Why don't we try midazolam? And then as I've gone through my career as a clinical vet and tried to apply those lower doses of midazolam, and I've found them to be ineffective, I'm glad we didn't go that route. And essentially what they wanted to do was not switch up the drug because we wanted to have a comparison between this study and the previous study.
Got it.
And I don't know what your experience with midazolam is in terms of potency. And I know that midazolam also comes in a syrup form, but it would still be a bigger, it would be a lot of drug to administer. And that's one of the main limitations of this study too, is that we're giving huge doses of this drug. And it was really hard to maintain patient compliance, trying to put it into high value food items, crushing the pill, giving the pill whole. Did they consume all of it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would obviously
Sure.
closely monitor, and I would only allow it to continue if they had done that, just to make sure that we had good study design. But that was very challenging. And also it being a controlled substance, you have to worry about, okay, if some of it's lost in the pan, how do you document that? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, so many thoughts there. Oh my gosh. And I think you just designed your next study. So
Yeah.
I can't wait to hear more about that. And
Yeah.
anybody listening that has some thoughts on midazolam in macaques, reach out to Adam, because I think that would be really interesting. So I'm so sorry that we're done. I could talk to you all day about anesthesia and the study, and so interesting, just the social aspects and
Yeah.
just what you're trying to do, I think is amazing. And just to refine how to get these guys together. And I really applaud you and your team's efforts in that way. Okay, so
you.
one last question. We ask this of everyone. Yes. And your question today is, you have so much experience here. What advice would you give somebody that is like, hey, I'm new to this. I know we want a social house. What's your advice?
Yeah. So first and foremost, be patient. I mean, as I mentioned there, this is a challenging process. It's not going to be black and white, easy peasy. You got to obviously closely monitor the animals, look for those behavior cues that indicate to you what the animal is doing, what it's thinking, and really trust your technicians, your behavioral biologists, your behaviorists, your program managers, people who have years of experience in the field. Really listen to what they're saying, trust their expertise, and be patient with this process in general. Now, I think one thing that I unfortunately didn't get to mention previously, because I kind of got into the weeds and I was all over the place, but when that wounding occurs, so, we talked a little bit about wounding in this, it is extremely important to assess the wounding pattern and the behaviors and external factors that may have precipitated the wounding episode. Was a technician in the room spraying down cages that led to an anxiety response, a stressful response in your partners that led to the wounding? Did one of the partners do something that was unacceptable in the eyes of the other partner? And was the wound more of a disciplinary wound rather than instigated aggression or non-instigated aggression, right? They were just kind of like, hey, don't do that. You know what I mean? So those are key things to focus in on. What I think we probably were a little too strict here with is some of the things that we were saying were incompatibility. We probably could have been a little bit more lenient and said, these animals probably just need to figure things out a little bit more. So very important that you look at those wounding patterns and, of course, the severity of the wounding. If it requires veterinary care, you have to separate them and take care of the wound. But look where it's at on the body. Look at what the precipitating factors were. That'll be a huge help to you. The last piece of advice I want to give is always try to maintain consistency in the proceedings as much as possible and conduct those introductions at times when human activity in the area is at a minimum. I was very concerned about doing it in the outdoor, and this was a limitation also of our study. I thought that there were too many external factors based on where the animals were housed in that sheltered outdoor housing, because you had people going by with lawnmowers. You could really hear the thunder and lightning on certain days. So I think trying to minimize those stressors as much as possible. And of course, it's not always going to be possible. You want to introduce animals where they're at. And I will say that with the other study that was done on the full contact introductions, that was all done indoors. So that made it a little bit more challenging from a comparative aspect, and I think was a limitation in our study. But always try to minimize the stressors and maintain consistency.
Oh my gosh, such sage advice. I knew you would have a lot of good advice for folks. So also, your information will be in the show notes. Anyone can reach out. Thank you again for being here. It's so nice to finally meet you.
You as well. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Last Word. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so be sure to leave your feedback in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more great content. We encourage you to submit your research manuscripts to our journals, JLAS and LAS Pro. We're always looking to feature impactful studies. You can also connect with us on our social media channels or email us directly at info@alas.org. We appreciate your listening today, and we'll see you next time on The Last Word, an ALAS podcast. Until then, stay curious and stay connected.